You know, more than any other time, I think, in history, because of television and, the different marvels of mass communication, billions of people have had their attention focused on the problems and the upheavals and the traumas of the people we collectively call the Jews, and maybe more specifically called in biblical terms the house of Judah. And the house of Judah includes the tribe of Judah. It includes a certain part of the tribe of Benjamin and probably maybe not all of the tribe of Levi, and maybe bits and pieces of a few other tribes. Every day we read the newspaper, we pick up a magazine, or we listen to the radio, and we hear reports that the Jews, who have a nation in the Middle East now called Israel — it shouldn't be called Israel, but that's what they call it. They shouldn't call it that, but they do. And they've had it for about 30 years, 35 or 40. We hear that some of their leaders have accomplished or decreed this or that. Maybe specific measures have been taken to resolve some type of problem in Jericho or Hebron or Bethlehem or Jerusalem or some other place in the land now lived in by the descendants of the house of Judah. And, that focus in the media on the Jews, which is very significant. In fact, the very existence of a sovereign, independent Jewish nation is most emphatically one of the greatest miracles that has ever occurred in all the history of mankind. Because, brethren, for a long time there was no Jewish nation. The fact that there is one is a miracle. And it is also one of the greatest, most obvious, blatant proofs that we're very near the end of this work and the flight of the people of God into a place of safety. And the setting up in the city of Jerusalem, which God said would be a Jewish city when we did it, of the work of the two witnesses, and that work in that Jewish city will someday be carried on, and we're getting closer to the time when Mr. Armstrong and one of his assistants undoubtedly goes over there and begins to do that. We're drawing close to that age and that period of time. From 1948, the piece of real estate that the Jews now call home belonged to somebody else. I hope you realize that. The house I live in right now, 2 years ago, belonged to somebody else. Well, in 1948, prior to that, the land the Jews live in belonged to somebody else. And in fact, it had belonged to somebody else for almost 2,000 years. That's quite something. For 2,000 years, millions of Jews had lived every place but in Palestine or that area. A few were there, but not very many. In fact, most of the time they were banished and couldn't live there legally. They lived elsewhere. And they worked, as we know, and they strove, and they prospered, and some didn't prosper. They had families. A lot of them died in obscurity and weakness in hundreds of nations scattered all over the face of the world. I mean, here in the USA, when I was a kid in Canada, there were Jews all over Canada. There were Jews in the US. There were Jews all over Europe. There were Chinese Jews and Jews in the Arabian countries and Indian Jews, and on it goes. And though a lot of Jews over the centuries had, in a sense, dreamed of going back to their ancient homeland and rebuilding it and doing something there, and millions of Jews, every Passover, had prayed for centuries. Next year in Jerusalem. Brother, next year they didn't go back to Jerusalem. They prayed it. They wanted to go back, but they didn't go. Because they couldn't go back. Because that is so totally improbable and unlikely and fantastic that, it's not something you can even conceive of. After you have sold a house, and 10 years later you go back and you say to the new people who've been living there for a decade, hey, this is my house. What do they say to you? No, it's not. I've lived here for 10 years. Mine. What did the Indians say? We want to take the USA back. You white folks have had it for 300 and some years, barely. But this is our nation. We're taking it back. Would they take it back? Could they take it back? Would it be possible? It's so totally improbable, you can't even begin to conceive of the odds of the Indians or anybody going back to a place they lived in almost 2,000 years ago and saying it's mine. Yet in 1948, on May the 14th, the state of Israel, which should have been called the state of Judah or Judea, was brought into being in the city of Tel Aviv, and a man named David Ben-Gurion got up and he declared that nation an independent sovereign nation. And they hadn't lived there. They had not had a nation there for almost 2,000 years, and in fact they had not had an independent Jewish nation there for almost 2,500 years, long before Jesus Christ lived in this earth. When he walked on this earth, they were being ruled by the Romans. Almost immediately after they became a nation, a very tiny nation. If you look on the map, how big they are now and how big they were then, they were very, very small. Almost immediately, their country, this little nation, was attacked by the armies of Egypt and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and I don't know who all. I mean, they were just sort of attacked on all sides by Arab nations. They were hopelessly outnumbered. And they astounded the world by winning victory after victory after victory after victory after victory. It was really shocking. There weren't many of them there. And they won. And they're still winning. And they will win and win and win up to a certain point when Almighty God says, Judah has won enough battles, I will remove my hand from the armies of Judah, and from this point on, they will not win another war. That day hasn't come yet, but it will. I want you to understand today that the Jewish nation was created by divine fiat, by divine dictate. And it has been preserved by God now for 30 years, after having not existed for almost 2,000. And this has occurred, brethren, almost entirely to serve the needs of the worldwide Church of God over the short haul, because we need a Jewish nation to finish this work. Did you know that? We must have a Jewish nation someplace to finish the work that we've been called to perform. And over the short haul, we need a Jewish nation. There must be a Jewish sovereign, independent nation someplace on the face of the earth. It must be in the Middle East, in fact, and it is. And then over the long haul, of course, God will use the traumas of this tiny Jewish nation and the problems and the trials and the upheavals that they have gone through and will go through to lead the Jewish people someday to a point at which they will repent, almost not quite collectively, but the vast majority will repent and accept Jesus Christ as Messiah. They will come to salvation and they will be given the Spirit of God, with very few exceptions, after Jesus Christ comes in the days of the kingdom of God, in part as a result of what will occur to their nation in the years that lie ahead. I contend, brethren, that the involvement of the worldwide Church of God in the activities of the sovereign state of Israel in the Jewish nation is a part of a design. It is a very wonderful design. It has been designed by God. It is working out very clearly according to program. And little has happened. I feel there's little happenstance in the activities that we have been involved in the sovereign state of Israel. We've been led to do what we've done. It's a part of the plan. And we've acquired a lot of very visible favor, and our visibility is quite high among some of the leaders in Israel at this present point in time. And a lot of them know us. Professor Mazar, of Hebrew University, looks at Mr. Armstrong as a very close personal friend, and that's sort of interesting because Professor Mazar is a known public figure in Israel. And we have other known public figures who view Mr. Armstrong as a personal friend. Now, why? Now, Teddy Kollek, who's the mayor of Jerusalem, is another man who speaks of Mr. Armstrong in very glowing terms, and when he talks to Mr. Armstrong, he talks in very, very positive, affectionate, warm, friendly terms. And it was he who introduced Mr. Rader to the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church a couple of, I guess it goes back about a year now, and squired him around and took him here and took him there. And he holds dinners in our honor. Mr. Armstrong goes over there, and there's always a dinner, and Mr. Kollek is there. And somehow he's drawn to Mr. Armstrong, and there is a very real tie. Now, do we have that kind of relationship with the mayor of Los Angeles? Ever seen, the mayor of L.A. and Mr. Armstrong together, and there's this beautiful hall, and the mayor of L.A. has, financed a dinner, and has invited all the biggies in the city and the dignitaries to come, and then there's a microphone, and the mayor of Los Angeles, you know who he is, stands up there in front of the mic, and Mr. Armstrong comes up, and he throws his arms around Mr. Armstrong, and gives him a big bear hug, and he pats him on the back, and says, "This is my friend, Herbert W. Armstrong." Have you ever seen that occur? Of course you haven't. Of course you haven't. I doubt, brethren, that you ever will. Now, it may occur. It may. And yet there's something significant about the fact that it has and does and will occur in the city of Jerusalem, which is a lot smaller than L.A. Population-wise, it's not a big town. There's a dozen cities in the U.S. that are bigger than the city of Jerusalem. Why does Teddy Kollek like us? Ever wondered about that? We built a park in Jerusalem. We haven't built one in Pasadena. How come we don't build parks in Pasadena? And why bother to build a park in Jerusalem for the poor Jewish and Arab children of the city? And why is there this little plaque on the park over there that says Herbert W. Armstrong Square in Hebrew and in English? There's no plaque in Pasadena that says Herbert W. Armstrong Square. Why hasn't the mayor of Pasadena put up a plaque that says Herbert W. Armstrong Square? Why hasn't he done that? Because the mayor of Pasadena doesn't necessarily like us all that much. Because we have not necessarily been led by God to curry the favor of the mayor of Pasadena at this point in time. We've tried to be a good example and all that type of thing, but somehow that relationship hasn't really congealed in the dramatic way that it has in Jerusalem. Now, our students work every summer on the City of David archaeological dig. And for several years, going back now into the late 60s and early 70s, I guess, they worked on another dig that was even nearer to the Temple Mount. They didn't work on the dig right at the Mount, but about 100 feet or so away from it. And the inspiring thing to me, brethren, is that we have always gotten rave reviews about the example of our kids from people in charge of those archaeological projects. They see the example of other people who have gone through. They see the example of some of the Jewish kids there in Israel who are working on the dig in their own nation. They see the example of the kids from Hebrew University, and they look at our kids and they say, hey, these are special human beings. Why have we gained that kind of favor? You know, through all of these different channels, our reputation has grown and has been magnified in the land of Israel in a way that it hasn't quite grown in the USA as yet. Mr. Armstrong over there is a known public figure. He is not a known public figure in the USA. He is a known religious figure here. He is not known there in quite the same way. He is not viewed as a, quote, religious figure, quote, unquote, in the way that Billy Graham is. He is viewed in a slightly different light. And it's a very important thing. Now, they like us as human beings. They know we make mistakes. We have made some mistakes over there, and some of them have seen some of the big mistakes that we have made. They've also seen our desire to, compensate and make up for some of our errors. They have seen our desire to reach out to them. They have been impressed by that. I want to read something in the Worldwide Church of God News, which we read many, many months ago. It was a report written. Let's see if I can come up with it. Maybe I brought the wrong one with me today. I think I did. Well, I brought the wrong one. It was a report written by Mr. Dick Page. And it was a very interesting report because somebody had asked him a question about the reaction and the feelings of the people of Israel towards Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. And I think somebody said, do they ask about him? He was over there, and they said, do they ask about Mr. Armstrong? And he said, yes. They asked about Mr. Armstrong a great deal. And he made an interesting quote. He said, they don't necessarily know why they seem to be drawn toward Mr. Armstrong. He said, they don't really know why. But there's something about the man that draws the Israelis to him. And people continually ask, when is our friend Mr. Armstrong coming back? That was the end of the quote I wanted to give you. They continually say, when is our friend Mr. Armstrong coming back? Well, someday, brethren, their friend Mr. Armstrong will come back and he'll stay. Very likely for 3.5 years. He will go back and he will stay. And when he goes back to stay, he will be welcomed. He will be welcomed, you see. And there is method in our madness. Some of the things of God don't always look logical, but they are when you begin to see the design and the plan. Why all this favor and why all of this, let's call it love and affection that comes from a lot of people over there and live in a little nation, the homeland of a couple of millions of Jews who have come into that nation in the last 30, 40, 50 years from all around the world. It's a question we have to ask. Now, I'm sort of excited by the fact that there is a special relationship between us and the Jews who are, I feel, and you don't have to agree with me, one of the most fascinating, significant, and interesting peoples on the face of the earth. And you don't have to agree with that. I think that. I think I can even prove that God sort of thinks that. But I sort of think Mr. Armstrong thinks that. I sort of think Mr. Rader thinks that. But you don't have to think that. You can have your own opinions. Now, why? Well, this is a good question. Why was Jesus born a Jew? Now, why wasn't he born an Indian? Why wasn't he born a Norwegian? They're good people. Why wasn't he born an Englishman? Oh, there's nothing better than an Englishman. And Jesus wasn't born an Englishman. Why wasn't he born a flag-waving, patriotic, American? There were Manassites back then. The tribe of Manasseh was up in Europe already. He could have been born in Manasseh. God could have worked that out. He could have been born in an Oriental nation. He could have been born a Dutchman. Well, Dutchmen are very solid people. Why not be born a Dutchman? Why in Judah? Now, God says the Jews are not a superior race. They make mistakes and have defects like everybody does. In fact, they have huge defects like everybody does. Yet there is, brethren, a special element in the character of the Jewish people that God is drawn to. And we're drawn to it as well. And that element God has used because it has come down through time, in the genes and in the chromosomes. And it's an element in their character that has changed the face of the earth, that has changed the face of the history of all mankind, and will someday change your life and my life in a very dramatic way. And that trait of character, brethren, will someday bring on the Holocaust that will bring this world, this earth, and this age and this time to a screeching halt and require the intervention of Jesus Christ to stop that final war. Well, it's a wonderful trait used properly. It's a kind of an enduring quality, a persistence, a dogged, never say die, keep on going, never stop, persevering, stubborn persistence, the indomitable spirit that has always been the spirit of the Jewish people God has used. And He will use it again in a rather interesting way. Well, He's already used it in an interesting way. We all know that Mr. Stan Rader is a Jew. Does he have a dogged, keep on going, enduring, never say die, indomitable, let's not quit, go on to the end of it all kind of an attitude? Yeah. Where did that come from? Well, we'll talk about where that came from. Romans chapter 1. God has used it so many ways. The Old Testament is here because of that character. Romans chapter 1. We'll see the focus God places on the conversion of the Jewish nation, which is essentially a future event that is not for this age. So a tiny number of Jews will be called to salvation in this age, but not a lot, a few, and generally when they're called, it will be in the midst of a rather traumatic situation. Various crises will cause it. Romans chapter 1. I have not a wedding ring in my hand, in the sense that I wear it as a wedding ring. It's a kind of a signet, and it's a bar mitzvah ring, by the way, not my bar mitzvah ring, because I was not born a Jew, but it is a bar mitzvah ring. It was a bar mitzvah gift to a young Jewish kid when he turned 12 or 13, and his father bar mitzvahed him, and his sister gave him this ring. And when he was 15, he dropped the ring, and I think a car drove over it, and there's a little tiny, skimpy, dinky little diamond. His sister was only 15. I mean, it's not an expensive ring. And the car smashed the diamond and smashed the signet, and, any jeweler would say it's worthless. It has no value because the diamond smashed and scratched, and the signet has three big little pieces pulled out of it, and if you look at it closely, it's not a beautiful ring. It's been sort of beat up. Anyway, when he was 17, he heard the World Tomorrow broadcast, and he began to be called and wanted to come into the Church of God, but his father literally threatened him with death. He said, if you leave Judaism and become one of those, evil Christians, and there is a lot of feeling like that amongst Jews. They've gone through a lot of persecution, and in turn they have a lot of very strong feeling about conversions outside of Judaism, and he threatened him with death. He chased him with knives, he chased him in his car and tried to ram him several times, and he couldn't come to services because of the danger of his father finding out where the church was and creating havoc. He was fully capable of it. I remember for about a year, on many occasions, myself and this young Jewish kid who was then only 17 would walk up in the mountain in the middle of Montreal, Quebec. There's a big mountain in the middle of the city. We sit up on that mountain and we'd talk for hours on Sundays because he couldn't come to services on the Sabbath. And we would talk and talk and talk and talk. And he could really talk. I mean, I tell him I can spare maybe an hour and a half, and I drive over there, and he would go over on his motorcycle, and we'd meet, and we walk up on the mountain on beyond the lake on the middle of Mount Royal. And after an hour and a half, I tell him I have to leave now. I really have to go. It's time for me to go. And 3 hours later, I would still be there. When I say Jews have this enduring persistence, I'm not kidding. He would almost tie me down. I couldn't leave. And we talked for hours and hours and hours. Well, finally the time came. He was 18 and a half when he left home. And that was very traumatic as well. And he was able to come to services. And there was a point, because we had gone through a lot together, and he'd gone through a lot of trauma. He said he wanted to give me a gift, and I said, well, you can't really do that. Mr. Armstrong doesn't approve of members giving ministers gifts. It creates wrong precedents and wrong feelings. And he said, well, what if I don't tell him and you don't tell him? And I said, well, that doesn't really work either, because that's deception. He has said no gift. And he said, well, what if it's a totally worthless gift? Well, he said, what if it looks like it's not worthless, but really is worthless? And you could tell Mr. Armstrong, it isn't worth a penny, nobody would want it, because it's been sort of messed up. I said, well, depends on what it is. So he had this in his pocket. He pulled out this ring, that's the one I have on, and explained to me that the diamond has been shattered, that the signet has been broken up, which it has, and he said he wanted to give it to me. And I took the ring. I thought, well, I couldn't turn the kid down. I really couldn't turn him down. I kept the ring, and I began to gain some weight, and my wedding ring wouldn't fit. So I tried it on. I finally got the wedding ring off and put this on, and it fits beautifully. now that I have fat fingers. And I've worn it ever since as a kind of a memento and as a kind of a symbol. To me, it's sort of symbolic. It's sort of symbolic. God says some very, very vital, exciting things about the Jewish nation and the Jewish race. When I baptized that young man, I realized I was doing something which is a little unusual. We do not baptize a large number of members of the tribe of the house of Judah. We do baptize a few, and we will. And yet most of that lies ahead of us. It has symbolic value and sentimental meaning, but it also makes me think of what lies ahead. Something very, very exciting lies ahead for them and for us. A very difficult time for them and for us, and then a very exciting time. Notice verse 13 in the book of Romans. I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but I couldn't, even though I wanted to bear fruit among you, even as among other Gentiles, the Apostle Paul wrote. And he was very clear, that they were Gentiles. He didn't sort of want to beat around the bush and say, well, you might hurt your feelings if I said you're a Gentile. Some people get sort of silly about that. No big deal. You are what you are. I'm better both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and the unwise. So as much as is in me, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are Rome as well. He said, I'll go any place, in any nation, and preach the truth of God. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto salvation. To everyone that believes, to the Jew first of all, because they were called chronologically first. All of the disciples were Jews. The kings over the 12 tribes will all be Jews. And you and I, if you're a Manassite in the kingdom of God, will look to your ruler. He'll be a glorified divine being, but he will not be a former Manassite. He will be a former Jew. All of the 12 were Jews. The tribes will be governed someday by Jews. Jesus as a man was a what? A Manassite. No, a Jew. You see, sometimes we sort of begin to think, well, we're the favored tribe. Oh, well, if there is a favored tribe, I would say God has called more of the top leaders out of Judah. Certainly even in this age, that applies to some degree. Mr. Rader is of Jewish descent, and we've often wondered about Mr. Armstrong's genealogy as well, because he can trace himself back to King David, and King David was also a Jew. There's probably been some mixing there. Well, genealogies are not the essential thing. We don't put a lot of stress on genealogy and everything of the kind. But let's say it is an interesting side point. To the Jew first. Now, in the kingdom of God, God will also convert the tribe of Judah first of all, then the rest of Israel, and then the other Gentile nations. Jew first, also to the Greek. Turn to the book of, Romans chapter 3, verse 1. Paul was dealing with some heavy racism in the city of Rome. It was a very racist area, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic feeling, anti-Jewish feeling at the time, and Satan has built that. People say, well, why is there so much anti-Semitic feeling in the world? There's anti-Italian feeling or anti-French feeling, but it never has become as dramatic as the anti-Semitic tendencies have been in the human heart. Why? Well, why does Satan persecute the church of God? Because we're the spiritual people of God. Why does Satan persecute the Jews? Through other nations and anti-Semitic feeling, because they have been the only people who have maintained a certain knowledge of some of the laws of God, perhaps in a physical way, but nonetheless they have. And to that degree, they are still the physical people of God. And of course, Israel is also the physical people of God, and, because we've kept some of those things. And all the Gentiles are also God's people. God deals with all nations. And yet, there are some special things. Chapter 1, chapter 3, verse 1, that God has given to the Jew. Notice, what advantage then has the Jew? What profit is there in circumcision? Well, some people would be very quick to say, well, none. Oh, there's none. There really are, there's no profit. Is there any profit in circumcision? What did Paul say? Verse 2, he said, much. Every way. Oh! Now on a spiritual level, there's, we all have the same equal right, to come to God. And he's not talking spiritually, he's talking in physical things and what God has done. And, there is much profit. Of course, there are also some problems in being a Jew because all of this racism developed by Satan has invariably been there over the centuries. It's interesting, even Paul wrote this to the Romans. And a few years after Paul wrote this to the Romans, just a few years later, a Roman army, a massive Roman army left Rome. Maybe with some of the sons of some of the members of the Church of God in Rome, in that army. And they set sail for Palestine under, what's his name, Titus, and they slaughtered the Jewish people. Their hatred was so strong, they set fire to the temple in Jerusalem. They burned it to the ground. They wiped out the Jewish nation, and from that time forth, there has been no Jewish nation until 1948. It was a strong, strong anti-Jewish feeling. Now, Paul is attempting here to point out to these Romans who had been raised in a very anti-Semitic environment. The Jews had many qualities. The Jews had a distinctive spirit, and that God had used that distinctive spirit in a very special way. He said, much, verse 2, every way, chiefly because that under them were committed the oracles of God. The Old Testament, he means. And for thousands of years, they faithfully preserved the Old Testament. And you see, when God gave the Old Testament to the Jews, not to Israel, because Israel didn't have the character to preserve it, and I'll prove that in a minute, but to Judah, he knew that they had that kind of stubborn, indomitable, persistent, never say die, bullheaded mentality that would cause them to protect and to preserve the Old Testament at all costs. If they had to die to the last man to preserve it, the last Jew left alive would have the Torah and the scrolls and these books, the Old Testament, in his hands, running for the hills if he was the last Jew to survive. It would go on. And it did. And sometimes it almost came to that. What other nation has kept the same religion alive for 3,000 years? I mean, I know the Jews have diluted some things, but I mean basically the same religion, based to some degree in the Old Testament. Can you think of anybody? I mean, the average American doesn't keep the same religion alive for 50 years. He converts to something new every, twice in his life. Most of you have done that. You've been raised in the religion of your forefathers? Well, of course you have not. I mean, none of you that I know of, with the exception of people under 20 or 25, have been raised in the Church of God. Under 25. There's also my wife who was raised in the Church of God. She's 26. No. But you know what I mean. We do tend to change religions and beliefs. And, there were pogroms. They made an attempt. The Muslims attempted to convert the Jews to Islam. The Christians and the Crusaders attempted to convert the Jews to Christianity. And a few hundreds did convert, admittedly, but by and large, what occurred, brethren, with all the killing and the dying and the pogroms and the persecution, the Jews kept right on being Jews. And nobody's done that. Nobody else has ever done that. What other nation has survived for 2,000 years without a nation? I mean, what other people have survived for 2,000 years without a homeland? Without a center of linguistic and cultural and national background. The people say, well, the Armenians have done that, and I say they have not. I think Armenians are wonderful people, but they've survived for about 70 years without a nation. Now they got one again in the Soviet Union, but they haven't survived for hundreds of years without a nation. The Armenians have always basically had a nation to go back to. There's always been an Armenian homeland, even though they've been somewhat scattered. People say, well, the Gypsies have survived, and they haven't had a homeland and still don't. Watching a lot of Gypsies in Europe. You walk up to a gypsy. Now, they know they've been in Europe for about 800 years, and you say to a gypsy, what's your, if you go way back in your history, where did you people come from? And they look puzzled and say, well, some of the elders say we came from Egypt, and some say from India, and some say from Mongolia. Well, we're not sure. We know we came from someplace, east, 800 years, they came into Europe about the year 1200. They've forgotten. They really don't know. The Gypsies have changed their religion. I mean, up to 50 years ago, they were all sort of basically Catholic in a rather pagan way. Now a lot of Gypsies have become Pentecostals. And all over France, there are big Gypsy Pentecostal churches, and they're converting by the thousands to Pentecostalism because it fits their nature to some degree. They changed. But the Jews have always known exactly, specifically, who they were, and their sense of identity has remained powerful. Now, who did that, brethren? Well, God did that. But God did that by using a trait of character they have, which is both wonderful and awful. That persistent, keeping on, endurance, that unrelenting ability to, come back up, is one of the most wonderful traits of character you can have. If you got that, I see you got something worth its weight in gold in a human way. Now, God has used that, and that has been more common amongst them, possibly, than any other group of people on the face of the earth. And they have incredible recuperative powers. God knew they would, even if they came down to a very small group. I mean, the whole story of Masada is unbelievable. What the Jews did. Would anybody else do what the Jews did in Masada? I don't think so. Now, for 3,000 years they have said, we've got to preserve the Old Testament. And they have. Somehow, even secular Jews somehow have the same need to preserve in a secular way certain traditions and ideas and ideals. For 2,000 years, Jews have said, we've got to go back to Jerusalem. And, next year in Jerusalem, even though they lived in Russia, or in Canada, or in Spain, or in Algeria, next year they didn't go back. And then next Passover they again prayed, well, next year we'll go back.
Didn't go back. Next year they prayed, next year we will, and they kept on doing it year after year after year after year, and finally, what did they do? Well, brethren, they went back. You know what that means? You know what's going to happen in a couple of years? When a Jew looks back in his history, when he harks back to what he used to do, what the fathers did, what the patriarchs did, invariably someplace along the line, he wants to start doing it again. Because that's the Jewish way. When he sets his jaw, he's like a steamroller. And, all the threats, all the wars, all the poverty, all the pogroms, all the mass conversion programs by Islam or what have you will not stop them. That's why they won so many victories in the last 30 years. Yes, God gave them the victory in the last 30 years in those wars with the Arabs and the other nations around them. But He used a trait of character that was in them to begin with. And, steamrollers is what they are. That's why the Father wanted His Son born of a woman of Judah. That's interesting too. Once again, Christ could have been born as any other nation on the face of the earth. The Father knew Christ would have to endure 33 years of life without ever sinning. He wanted to make sure Christ had good heredity. He filled him with the Spirit of God from birth. Helped him to endure and to remain sinless for 33 years. I ordained in 1972, I think it was, a young Jew named Sam Kneller. And he's now the minister of the church in Paris, France. And he was at that time one of my assistants in Montreal. And Sam Kneller is a full-blooded Jew and a bona fide card-carrying member of the House of Judah. I mean, he's one of them. And he has quite a story. He was raised in South Africa, Spain, England, and Canada in that order. And typically Jewish background. They moved all over the world. Very strong Jewish parents and very wealthy Jewish parents. His father moved every 6 or 7 years because he would get bored after he'd made 10 or 15 million. He got bored making millions of dollars in this country, so he would simply sell out, move to another country, and see if he could do it all over again in some other country. So they went from South Africa, Johannesburg, and the gold thing to Spain, and the clothing thing to England, and I don't know what it was there, and then to Canada into furs. And when Sam Kneller was 13 years of age, of course, he was cut out of the same cloth as his father. And when he was 13, he bought his first house. Well, this is the guy who became our minister. When he was 13, he bought his first house. Now, you might wonder, how could a 13-year-old boy buy a house when he's 13? Well, I'm talking to you about a 13-year-old Jewish boy. You understand there's a difference here? You have to get that point. When he was 12, he got a paper route. One paper route in Johannesburg. They got paper routes just like here. Throw them on the doorstep just like here. And within 6 months, he was running every kid in the neighborhood. He wasn't just throwing the papers out. He was showing the other kids how to throw the papers out. He's quite a leader. And he's not very big, but he is mighty. And by the time he was 13 and a half, he was running every paper out in the city of Johannesburg, which is a big city, and he made so much money, and his savings began to stack up. When he was 13 and a half, almost 14, he had thousands of dollars in the bank, and his mother, who was a good Jewish mother, said, Sam, you cannot, let your money sit there in the bank. You got to do something with it. It's time to learn what money is all about. And she took the money, took him out, and said, find a house. He found a house, and she bought it for him in her name. 13-year-old boys can't buy houses in South Africa. And a year later, they moved to Spain, and he sold the house, and I don't know what his profit was, but it was quite nice. It was quite a hefty profit. Well, that is sort of typical of what Sam Kneller is like. Now, when he was 18, he went to Israel and became a student at Hebrew University, and he began to mature and think about life and notice things. And he had thought at the time of staying in Israel, but when he was 20, he got an invitation from an uncle of his who lived in Antwerp, Belgium. Now, his uncle ran the diamond industry. What else? I mean, for all of Western Europe. This is his uncle. And his uncle is a conservative Jew, wears the little cap and, everything. Very conservative, very religious gentleman in the Jewish way. And he invited his son to come and visit him in Belgium, and which he did. And I forget whether that was his Uncle Morris or his Uncle Moshe. I think it was Moshe. I don't know which one. Anyway, he's told me about all of his uncles. So we got over there in Belgium, and at that point in time, our radio ships were in the English Channel off the coast, beaming Mr. Armstrong into England, but it also got into Belgium and into Antwerp. And Sam Kneller, who could speak English, you see, because he was raised in South Africa, heard the broadcast, and God opened his mind, and he went to Ambassador College and became a student, to the utter dismay of his parents and to the utter dismay of his Uncle Moshe, who felt responsible for the conversion of his nephew from Judaism to Christianity. Uncle Moshe was very upset. Anyway, Sam Kneller has always been a steamroller, and he arrived in Canada after graduation because we needed somebody who could speak French And as a good Jew, Sam Connor could speak virtually any language you wanted him to speak within 6 months. It just was there. And he has that ability. So we worked with him there. And he's about 5'3" tall. He's the shortest steamroller I've ever seen, but he is a steamroller. And nothing, I tell you, nothing stopped this gentleman. I mean, when he decided to go the way of God, he has gone the way of God. And, no matter what has occurred, and a lot has occurred, he has been buried officially with a casket in a synagogue in Canada. He's been buried. He is dead to Judaism. And dead as far as his father is concerned. Now, about 6 years ago, his uncle Moshe, I guess it was, or was it Morris? I forget which one. Or Abe. I don't remember. Maybe it was Abe. Anyway, somebody, one of them in the diamond industry, said to him, look, I'll give you an office in San Francisco and enough diamonds to make $1 million in your first year. I'll set you up. If you leave your Christian church and come back to Judaism, you'll be a millionaire within a year. You know what he said to his Uncle Abe or whoever it was? He said, of course not. His uncle was upset, but you see, he's got this endurance, this, keeping on quality to him. A couple of years back, I guess his father had learned the lesson from his uncle, or hadn't learned the lesson, I should say. His father, who was in furs, offered him half of his business. Now, his father doesn't run a corner grocery store. His father has a boutique in Vancouver, Canada, full of expensive fur coats. The cheapest one in there is $5,000 because he custom, he puts them together himself. He doesn't mass produce the coats. He's got a boutique in Tokyo and a boutique in Hong Kong. This is a rather wealthy gentleman. Sam has told me he doesn't know how many millions of dollars his father is worth, but he's estimated it was 25 or 30. And his father said, I'll give you half the business, my son, if you come back into full partnership with me and you drop this crazy religion and you come back to Judaism. You know what Sam Connor said? He didn't have to go home and look at his budget and analyze his paycheck from the Worldwide Church of God, which isn't all that great, He's over in Europe. They can't afford to pay you high salaries over there. They can't afford to pay him here either. He said no. He was hurt because he knew his father would be hurt. And his father was very hurt. But, his example to me is inspiring. He's gone the way of God. And he's gone the way of God with endurance and persistence that I feel is unusual. Now, millions of Jews, of course, are just as doggedly persistent in going the wrong way. I mean, that's why Judaism has continued on. Because unless God opens the Jewish mind, the Jews have gone that way so strongly and so doggedly and so resolutely that it's very, very hard to change. And that's why we have an Old Testament, frankly. That's why some things are going to happen in a couple of years, and God tells us that there is a sign given to the people of God to flee that involves the Jewish need to keeping on doing what Jews have always done. And they're going to begin to do some interesting things in a few years that Jews have always wanted to do, haven't always done because they haven't always been in the land of promise or in the land of Palestine or had their own nation. But now that they do, they're going to begin to do some things again. Now, we'll get to that in a minute. You need to watch the Jews. Romans chapter 9, verse 1. Watch the Jews. Very significant, important people. And maybe you can see now why God was inspired to give them the custodianship of the Old Testament. Not to Israel. Now, Israel went into captivity within 30 years. The Israelites had dropped the Sabbath and the holy days and the laws of God, had given it all up and had become virtual lackeys of the Assyrians. 3 decades. And we, in our captivity, dropped it all. The Jews went captive into a neighboring nation a little bit later on. Did they drop it? They didn't stop. They kept on. We dropped it. God knew we would. We don't have the same nature they have, quite the same way. He didn't give the Old Testament to us, fortunately, otherwise there wouldn't be one. Chapter 9, verse 1. I say the truth in Christ, I lie not. Hey, he's dealing with some of this racism again that was there in the city of Rome amongst the brethren. But I have great sorrow and heavy sorrow in my heart, verse 2, and I wish that myself could be accursed from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen, the Jews, that is, according to the flesh. And he was talking to the Romans, and he was the apostle to the Gentiles. And here he was talking about his own fleshly people and the Jews and their contribution and their character. Who are Israelites? So the Jews are Israelites, but all Israelites aren't Jews, as you know. Manassites are not Jews. Manassites are Israelites. But Jews are Israelites. So Jews can be called Israelites. They are a tribe of Israel. But all Israelites are not Jews. To whom? Now talking specifically to the Jews, verse 4. Pertain the adoption, that is the sonship, at least in the physical way, and the glory of God. Now the glory of God came down into a temple built by a Jew named David. David was not a Manassite, he was a Jew. And he built a temple to God on a mountain. And the glory of God, the Bible says, descended and came into that temple and filled the holy place in that temple. And they had the glory of God for a while. But they built another temple later on, and God's glory didn't come into that temple. And the glory of God is not with the Jewish people right now, but it was at one time. And the covenants they had and the giving of the law. Now, when the tribes of Israel came to Mount Sinai, the Jews were there, and so were all the other tribes. We were there. Manasseh was there. Ephraim was there. And Reuben was there. And all the others were there. But the one who went up to get the law was Moses. And Moses was a Levite. And the Levites and the Jews and a lot of Benjamin have combined together to form the house of Judah. So once again, on the physical plane, the most important man on that mountain at the time of the giving of the law was a man who was of the tribe of Levi, but who became a part of the house of Judah as time went on. And then there was the service of God. The Levites did that. That means the offerings in the temple. But you know, a Jew built the temple, and they were given the job of maintaining it. Levi, that blended in with the Jews, had the job of serving in the temple and offering the sacrifice and looking after those things. Now, therefore, to the house of Judah, you see, the overall house was given that service. Now, that was done in that temple. That temple was destroyed for the last time in 70 A.D., and the Jews were booted out of the land of Palestine, and there's been no service of God for a long, long time. Did you know someday the service of God is going to be reinstated? I don't know if it'll be in a temple or not. We're not sure of that. But the service is going to again reoccur. The service of God. And it's sort of interesting that the Jews have been sort of frustrated for 1900 years because they couldn't fulfill that service. And a lot of them still know who the Levites are that can do it. Amongst the Jews, you find names like Cohen, which means the priest, or Levi, or Levine, or Levine, especially in the movie industry. Everyone seems to be named, Levine or Levine or some takeoff on that. And you can analyze a group of Jews, and you can find somebody in there who probably is of the priestly tribe and of the Levitical line. And they know that. It's interesting that they haven't done this for a long time, but the interest in doing this is growing. In Hebrew University right now in Jerusalem, you can take a class on how to do the service of God. They have classes, you see, and this isn't some little rumor I picked up through an evangelical Baptist newspaper. Now, some of you do things like that. You hear these wild rumors about temples being built in the, and they already have these tons of rock in the USA in somebody's garage, and it's going to happen next week, and you come and tell me, oh, Mr. Catherwood, huh? And I say, where'd you get this? Well, I read it in the evangelical Signs of the Times. Don't believe with those people right there, the most hysterical types. They will see things that, they see 666 written all over the place where it is not written, and I just don't buy a lot of that. This is simply a fact. Hebrew University in their prospectus does offer a course, if you are a Levite, if you are a Jew, in how to go into a temple. They don't have one, but how to go into one if you had one, that's interesting, and carry out the service of God. How to kill an animal, and when, and why, and where. Now, you see, a Jew cannot sacrifice in a synagogue. No, there's no sacrifices in Jewish synagogues. If you come from Alabama or Mississippi, the Deep South, you were told by your good Baptist preacher that in those awful Jewish synagogues, they're killing all these animals. Well, that's another fairy tale. They're not. They're not. I hope that has died out. But when I was in the South, people kept bringing those things up to me. There was a synagogue in Birmingham, Alabama, and there's always full of blood. Blood runs, a foot deep in the aisles. No. Only in temples. They haven't had one since 70 A.D. Now, why is this course going on in Hebrew University, you see? Why do a certain number of young Jews want to learn how to do the service of God? I'll tell you why. They want to learn how to do that because they're Jews. And the Old Testament says they used to do that. And a lot of Jews, more than any other race, tend to hark back to what they used to do, and then they want to start doing it all over again because you've got this incredible recuperative ability, this need, you see, to redo, to continue on, to endure, to persist, that God has always used. So whatever they used to do, they're going to want to do it again someday. We're not like that. You see, we can burn our bridges, and that's the end of that. Jews have a hard time burning bridges because that's their nature, and God has used that nature. And he's going to get up there, and he's going to sacrifice an animal. And it's going to irritate a lot of people. There's going to be one unbelievable hullabaloo as a result. There's going to be an uproar all over the Middle East. Because you see, a Jew who prays or offers sacrifice on certain mountains in Jerusalem is profaning a Muslim holy place. They got the high places virtually all nailed down, and they're primarily in Muslim hands. There's going to be a big uproar someday. When that uproar occurs, and when a lot of Jews say, we want to keep on doing this, and they do keep on doing it, be forewarned, the time to flee to a place of safety is getting awfully close. Because that'll happen someday. Not only will it happen, but it'll be stopped. When it's stopped, after it begins and goes on, and they endure, and thousands of Jews worldwide say, we got to do this, the time has come to do it, and a few conservative rabbis have some visions and say, yeah, we got to do it, because Messiah is coming, it is time to begin to sacrifice again in or near or beside or inside our holy places. When that occurs, and the whole Arab world almost goes up in flames as a result, because they won't like that, I'll tell you, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Well, you can pretty well expect that we won't have a lot of time to finish our work after that. In a minute, I want to discuss some of the reasons why the Church of God is so involved with the Jews and what it'll lead to someday. But to give you the picture, I want to give you a little bit of Jewish history in capsule form. It'll be sort of rapid. But I want you to see what makes a Jew tick, and why they do what they do, and why they keep on doing what they keep on doing, and why they are a little bullheaded, and why they are very persistent, and why they do endure, why they've endured as a people now for thousands of years when other races have simply, disappeared from off the face of the earth. And something interesting about it. I want you to notice as we do this, the connection between their history as a people and the need to build a house for God, the need to bring sacrifice in that house or in that location, because it is very, very strong, a strong need. David felt that need. God inspired it. And we'll see that this type of need is going to reoccur on some level. We're not exactly sure how, but on some level. Remember in the life of Abraham, he had a son named Isaac. And one day God told Abraham to take that son named Isaac up into the mountains. And he said specifically the mountains of Moriah. That's in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. And he said, sacrifice unto me your only born son. And he said, there's a specific place where you must do it. On Moriah. On Mount Moriah. He went up on that mountain, and God stopped the sacrifice of his son on this outcropping of rock. So after that occurred, God, of course, didn't allow it to happen. Now, Isaac was not sacrificed. That site was a well-known site, and everybody knew where Mount Moriah was, and everybody knew where Isaac had almost been sacrificed. It was there, and everybody, the tradition carried on. People basically knew where it was. Well, about 800 years later, that outcropping of rock was still there. And it was a very good place on which to thresh wheat. So a young Jewish farmer had bought that outcropping of rock up in Mount Moriah, and he threshed his wheat there. This is 800 years later. And one day, King David, who was king of the Jews and king of Israel. But remember how Israel rejected him, and ultimately he was just king of the Jews. David, a Jew, king of the Jews and king of Israel, was driving by in a chariot, and he saw Ornan the Jebusite out on that outcropping of rock. He was up on Mount Moriah. And the Spirit of God was with him and in him and directed him there and said, go, in effect, and look at that outcropping of rock, because I have something special. 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Now, why do Jews keep on doing what they do? 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Well, let's see what they do. Verse 18. Quite a saga here. The saga of a mountain began with Abraham, went to David. That mountain is still there. And the Jews began to do things in that mountain for 1900 years until 1948, and there wasn't much they could do in that mountain. In fact, in 1948 they couldn't do much up there either because it didn't fall into their hands immediately. Verse 18. What about Mount Moriah? Then the angel of the Lord, 1 Chronicles 21, commanded Gad to send to David that David should go up and set up an altar unto the Eternal in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now notice he was to set up an altar, and he was to sacrifice there, brethren. Notice that, because that is very, very important. It doesn't say he had to wait until a temple was built, because he did build a temple to sacrifice. He went up, and on that rock, with no temple and no building, no nothing, he sacrificed to God. And that sacrifice was holy to God, and that location on that mountain became a holy place. He did this out of doors. That's sort of important. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. He didn't do it inside a temple, but that did become a holy place. And David, verse 19, went up at the saying of Gad and spoke to Ornan, who was out there threshing. End of verse 20, his wheat. And David came to Ornan, and Ornan looked and saw David and went out of the threshing floor and bowed himself down with his face to the ground. This was a man of great humility. And David said to Ornan, grant me the place of your threshing floor, that I may build an altar thereon. He was inspired to build an altar there. And verse 23, Ornan said to David, take it to you, and let my lord the king do that which is good in his eyes. Man of great respect towards his king. Lo, I give you the oxen also for burnt offerings, and the threshing instruments for wood, and the wheat for the wheat offering. I give it all. Wonderful attitude. And King David said to Ornan, nay, but I will verily buy it for the full price, and he bought it. He bought it from Ornan. And notice what occurred. Verse 26, he built there an altar, rather rudimentary altar, offered a burnt offering there and peace offerings, and he called upon God, and God answered. And then God began to inspire his mind. And David said in chapter 22, verse 1, David said, this is the house of the Lord God. This is the altar of the burnt offering for all of Israel. And David then commanded. God was inspiring his mind now to gather together the strangers that were in the land of Israel, all the many Gentiles who had a lot of abilities the Israelites didn't have. And he set masons to hew wrought stones to build the house of God. And he began to build a building on Mount Moriah at that location. And David prepared iron in abundance. But before the building was completely built, you see, they already were bringing sacrifice before the building of the building. Please notice that fact. They brought in cedar trees in verse 4 from Zidon and Tyre. And then David said in verse 5, as the building began to come together and the materials were being stacked up, Solomon my son is young and tender, and the house that is to be built for the eternal must be exceedingly magnifical. Quite a word. Magnifical, not just magnificent, but magnifical. There's something absolutely gorgeous. Of fame and of glory throughout all nations. I will therefore now make preparation for it. So David prepared abundantly, the materials, before he died. Now, he'd been a man of war, and God said to David, you can't build the house. You get the material together, and you can design it. But your son is going to have to build it because you've been too involved in war. Now, he was a man after God's own heart, but this warlike thing in David was not a part of his nature that was after God's own heart. Not everything in his heart was right. A lot was, and some wasn't. So he called on his son, verse 6, and charged his son to build a house for God. And I want to show you in a minute, this was up in Mount Moriah. Well, he did this. They began to build. Now, David said in verse 14, behold, in my trouble I've prepared for the house of God 100,000 talents of gold. Now, a talent in this age, in our time, is worth about $10,000. That's a lot of gold. And, all of these 100,000 talents that David himself contributed out of his own personal fortune, that's over $1 billion, as far as I know. And 1,000 talents of silver, brass and iron, and all of these things, they were to build it. Verse 15, moreover, there are workmen with thee in abundance, hewers and workers of stone and timber, and all manner of cunning men for every manner of work. And they began to build it. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, you notice again, this was up in Mount Moriah. The same mountain Solomon had been told to sacrifice Isaac upon. 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1. And Solomon began to build the house of God in obedience to what his father had said at Jerusalem. You see, the city was already coming closer to the mountain in Mount Moriah. In the mountain of Moriah. But the Eternal appeared to David his father in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began to build in the second day of the second month in the 4th year of his reign. And the building began to rise. And brethren, that was the most beautiful building the known world had ever seen. And God had Solomon erect one of the wonders of the ancient world. And he gave the instructions in verse 3. And you can read through it. Verse 5, the greater house he ceiling with fir trees, that he overlaid with fine gold, and set thereupon palm trees and chains. And he garnished the house with precious stones for beauty. And he overlaid the beams in verse 7, and the posts and the walls with gold. And he made the most holy house in verse 8. The length thereof was according to the breadth of the house. And on it goes. Verse 9, the weight of the nails was 50 shekels of gold. And it was magnificent. It didn't look like the First Baptist Church of Covina, We hold Spokesman's Club in back of a Presbyterian church in one of their meeting, sort of fellowship halls. And, I don't think there's any problem in doing that. And I sort of look at their church and, it's a little on the drab side. They're nice people, but they got Presbyterian churches tend to be drabish anyway. And there's this, the temple of God, didn't look like the first Presbyterian church of San Dimas. Brethren, the porch in front of the main structure rose 180 feet. That's as high as a modern skyscraper. That is at least 20 stories in height. That's how high the porch went. 20 stories. And then in back of it, you see, you have this sanctuary that was at least 90 feet long and about 35 feet wide. And the sanctuary itself was at least 4 stories high. And it was made of cedar beams. And everything was overlaid with gold. There was gold spread lavishly all over everything. And even on the doorpost it said there was gold. And it took 150,000 laborers 7 years to build. And notice what happened when it was dedicated. 2 Chronicles 7. I want you to see something about the Jewish heart and the soul of the Jewish nation, and what they have done, and what they have continued to do, and what they shall someday attempt to do again. They may not have time to build it. They may only bring sacrifice, as David did on a rock. But the service of God, they will reinstate. And ultimately, if there is time, and that is a part of God's design, they'll even build the building. That we're not sure of. Chapter 7 in 2 Chronicles. Notice what occurred. Verse 1, Solomon made an end of praying. They were dedicating the temple. And fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifice, and the glory of God filled the house. And the priest couldn't enter into the house of God, because the glory of the Eternal had filled the Eternal's house. They had the glory of God. You see, when this first began, it was there. Now, verse 11, thus Solomon finished the house of God, and the king's house, and all that came into Solomon's heart, to make in the house of God, and in his own house he prospered, and God appeared to Solomon by night, and said unto him in verse 12, I have heard your prayer, and I have chosen this place to myself for a house of sacrifice. If I shut up the heavens, that there be no rain, if I send pestilence, verse 14, if my people called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. Now that's a powerful thing to say. And the Jewish nation has not forgotten that promise. Right now, brethren, there is no house in their land in which this promise can be fulfilled. And there are thousands of conservative Jews that would like to see it occur. Then will I hear from heaven. My eyes will be open, and my ears attend unto the prayer made in this house. Verse 15. For I have chosen and sanctified this house. But he said in verses 21, 22, and 22, if they rejected God, turned from God, he would destroy that house. Well, he did destroy that house. 700 years went by, and the Jews lived in their nation, and Israel did too for a while. And then the Jews fell from God's favor, and God's wrath fell upon them, and that house that was built by Solomon was destroyed. It was there for 400 years, though, high up in Mount Moriah, inside what finally became the city of Jerusalem. But one day it was sacked and burned to the ground. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it was sacked and burned by a Babylonian army that God caused to come into the land, and we'll see why in a minute. This is a kind of a type of something to happen someday off in the future. The book of Lamentations tells us that. It describes this in detail. Jeremiah described it. But we'll notice in the historical book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 36, verse 11 and 12, exactly how it happened. Zedekiah was king. He was a young man, too young to be king, 21. And verse 12, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Eternal. He didn't humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet. The servant of God came to him, you see, and he wouldn't humble himself. Someday, the leaders of the worldwide church of God are going to go to the leaders of Judah again. And though there'll be friendship and warmth and love and bear hugs, they're not going to humble themselves. But they will listen. And they'll let us come. They'll let us come into their quarters. And they'll listen. And a few may react. But they're going to reject basically what we'll have to say. He didn't humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet. He rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who was already coming down to take the city captive and to destroy the temple and the city and the nation. And the chief priest rebelled, verse 14. And what occurred? Therefore, verse 17, God brought upon them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew the young men with the sword of die in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon the young men. He gave it into their hands. Notice verse 18. All the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of God, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all that he had brought to Babylon, all these he brought to Babylon, and they burnt the house of God. And that 34-acre quadrangle vanished off of Mount Moriah, and it was simply gone without a trace. And God says in Lamentations, someday something very similar is going to happen again. And he uses this literal burning of the house of God as a type. They broke down the walls and destroyed the city and burnt the palaces with fire, and they carried away the vessels. Now, historically, we know that they were in the land of Babylon for 70 years. That's given in the Bible. Jeremiah, in fact, prophesied that would happen. A whole generation lived in Babylon, and that land, Judea, the temple, the city, was simply lying in rubble. And then one day God inspired a carnal man. It's interesting how God can use carnal people to do this, to send some of the Jews back to build another temple and to resettle in the land. You know why that occurred? You know why that occurred? Cyrus, the king of Persia, who took over after the Babylonians began to decline, wasn't a converted man. But Daniel was a converted man. And there were Jews in that captivity that prayed and prayed and prayed. I mean, they are like, powerhouses sometime when they pray. And they wanted to go back to their ancient homeland. They wanted to resettle there. They wanted to build another temple. And so for 70 years they prayed in that captivity. And one day the king of the land of Persia heard about those prayers, saw their persistence, and he rewarded them. Verse 22, the same book, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. This was 70 years later, a long, long time down the road, 7 decades later. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Eternal was spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, that what he said might be accomplished. The Lord God stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus says the king, all the kingdoms of the earth are mine. Verse 23, and God has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which was in rubble, which is in Judah, which didn't exist. I mean, it was simply a name on a map, but there was no nation there. Who is there among you of all of his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Not the Lord my God, but the Lord his God. God wasn't, working in his life spiritually, but somehow he felt inspired to do this. Maybe that'll happen again. Maybe somebody else will help the Jews sort of put this together, help some Jews put it together. I don't know. The money, the needs, the inspiration may come from elsewhere. Maybe some of it will come from us. I don't know. Chapter 1 of the book of Ezra. Bill goes on in historical type. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of God by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, God stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make this proclamation and to, in effect, send thousands of Jews back. Verse 3 said, Who is there among you of all of his people who would like to go back to Judah and Jerusalem and build the house of the Lord God of Israel? He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And he said, get a lot of materials together. Verse 5, Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites and nobody else. I don't care if all the evangelicals say the other tribes went back. I don't care if all the evangelicals say that the Jews really are the descendants of all the 12 tribes. It doesn't bother me that a member a couple of Sabbaths ago got sort of uptight and said, I just don't like it when Catherwood talks about Israel. Doesn't bother me at all. Because Israel and the Jews were two nations then. Who went back? Judah, Benjamin, the priests, and the Levites, and nobody else. And they went back to build the house of God. And notice, Cyrus let them take back, some of the things that had been in the old temple. Verses 9, 10, and 11, he took back in verse 10, 30 basins of gold, silver basins of the second sort, and all the vessels of gold and of silver that were in the first temple, they took on back 70 years later. Now you know the story. That second temple was rebuilt by Zerubbabel, who is heir to the throne of Judah, and by Joshua the high priest, and they also are types of men to work in this age to build a spiritual building, because those two temples were types of the church of God, but they were also types of a possible physical temple as well. Now the second temple that Zerubbabel worked on, you'll see his name in chapter 2, verse 2. Was a rather small temple. They didn't have a lot of money to build. They weren't rich any longer. They were a captive people going back, so they built a rather dinky temple. It was sort of modest. And in the book of Ezra, chapter 3, it says some of the old men who had been there and had seen the first temple when Solomon, that Solomon had built, were so upset when they saw how dinky and modest the second one was that they simply burst into tears. They cried because they had seen the two temples, and they said, this is so small and so dinky. And this isn't the kind of temple we want as a center of worship, but that's what they had and that's what they kept. The young men didn't mind, though, because they didn't have any frame of reference. For about 400 years, they worshipped in that temple. They went back, and there was a new Jewish nation. It was always sort of subservient to somebody else. They really never got out from under subservience even then. And armies would come across their country, and one day Antiochus Epiphanes swept across Judah with his armies, and he saw the little temple there, and he sort of thought, Jews have this crazy little temple. And according to history, he took a pig and went into that little temple and he sacrificed that pig on an altar. Now the Jews were shattered by that desecration. That was an abomination and made their temple, in a sense, desolate, you see. It disqualified the temple from being a temple, they felt. So the Jews, in effect, felt they had to rededicate the temple, and they went through a whole rededication ceremony and rededicated the temple to God to purify it after that pig had been sacrificed there, because they said the temple had been made desolate. It was rededicated, which is part of the origin of the Feast of Hanukkah, which Jesus kept in John chapter 10, verse 22, and it's like Thanksgiving. There's nothing wrong with Hanukkah as such, except modern Jews have Christmasized it because they want to be like so-called Christians are. But, I mean, a converted person can sort of observe Hanukkah if they want to, as long as they don't have the Hanukkah bush and all the crazy pagan things that Jews have begun to do on the day of Hanukkah, which is not right. And the Hanukkah bush is a Christmas tree, by the way. It's so funny. They have these Christmas trees and they call them a Hanukkah bush. It's a Christmas tree. Because it falls usually in December, and, you know, they've gotten it all sort of messed up there. But there is an element of truth in that is okay. Now, that little temple, you see, rededicated, kept on until the century before Jesus Christ was born. Now, just before Christ was born, the Roman appointed king of the Jews, whose name was Herod. And remember, the Jews were still under, you know, subservience to other nations. They never had a totally independent country. And they had an appointed king named Herod, and he didn't like that temple because he had visions of grandeur. It was too little and too dinky, and he was embarrassed by it. So Herod took a lot of the public monies, a lot of the tax money, you see, because he really drew in the funds, and to build himself up, because he was a neurotic, paranoid, self-seeking megalomaniac, I think. I wasn't there to look at him, but I think that he was. And he was embarrassed by this dinky little building that he didn't like. He spent a fortune to enlarge it. He built additions to it. He built that temple into a magnificent kind of a gigantic fortress, to the point that the little original second temple was swallowed up, and it really became a kind of a third temple because it was so different and so much more beautiful, and it became a wonder of the ancient world. It became a marvel. So that was the temple that Jesus was in at age 12 when his parents came back looking for him. They said he was sitting in the temple, you see, answering questions and asking questions. That's where Jesus sat. That's the temple he threw the money changers out of. That's the temple that the people of God had rented a little hall in, way in back. It was such a huge temple. So many things happened there. And on the early Feast of Pentecost, a few dozens of members of this church were back in that temple in a little tiny room, because there were so many rooms in there, and that is where the Holy Spirit first came into that temple in a tiny room, and a few dozen members of the Church of God were begotten. It was a huge, magnificent building, one of the wonders, again, of the ancient world. So Acts 2 said they went back to the temple almost daily into that room and had services because it was available to them. And that temple too was destroyed, though. Matthew chapter 23, we'll see some prophetic type now. We'll see some things that begin to affect us in our age. Now, Jesus had stood in that temple one day and he looked out at the temple. It was beautiful and gigantic. Matthew 23, verse 37, rather. 23, verse 37. He said it was going to be destroyed. And there was type and antitype. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, verse 37, you that kill the prophets and stone them that are sent unto you, how often would I have gathered your children together? He meant the Jews. Jerusalem was the capital of a Jewish nation, but a subservient Jewish nation, tributary to the Romans. Behold, your house, in verse 38, is left unto you desolate. He said it's going to be desolated once again. They knew what that word meant. The temple was going to be destroyed. For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth. So you shall say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And Jesus went out, chapter 24, and departed from the temple, brethren. He knew the temple. He meant the temple. And he went out from it. And the disciples ran over to him and pointed to the buildings, it says in verse 1, and said, you mean this is going to be destroyed? This magnificent building that Herod has brought into being? And he said, yes. The end of verse 2, totally destroyed. That was type and antitype. Now, it happened then. In 70 A.D., Titus, a Roman general, attacked Jerusalem, and for 5 months tried to destroy the city. And ultimately, at the end of the 5 months, did destroy the temple in the midst of the city too. Now, brethren, only Hitler outdid Titus in bloodshed as far as persecuting the Jewish people. Titus surrounded the city at Passover season. It was jam-packed with 3 million Jews. About 1 million of them were Jews from other countries who had come to Jerusalem to keep Passover. 3 million of them. And within 5 to 6 months, 600,000 Jews had starved to death. 600,000 additional Jews had died in virtual hand-to-hand combat to protect their holy city and the temple from desecration again. 1.2 million Jews died before that 5-month siege was over, and it was pure hell. Did you know in 8 years of the Vietnam War, we lost 55,000 men in 8 years. They lost 1.2 million human beings, men, women, and children in only 5 months. And that siege in 70 A.D. was one of the most hellish, things to ever occur in all the history of mankind. Now, all that death and dying took place at one point for about 2 months. They threw between 4,000 and 6,000 dead bodies over the wall of the city every single day. And the armies, of course, were around the wall of the city. They threw the stinking dead bodies over the wall to rid the city and to keep the plague from coming in. Now, after 5 months, Titus simply moved in the city because the people were dying and starving. He took the city and he burned the temple. And he took the surviving Jews, not quite 2 million of them, captive. And that was the end, brethren, of the Jewish nation. They were sold as slaves into Africa, Europe. The Romans took thousands of them back to Rome as slaves. In fact, there were so many Jewish slaves to sell that they said at the time that a dog cost more money than a Jewish slave did, because the slave market was glutted with Jews to be sold as slaves any place. And that is why, for almost 2,000 years, you found Jews in North America and Jews in Europe and Jews in Arabic countries. Jews were every place. They had been sold and dispersed from that point on, and they never were allowed to go back as a group. In fact, for hundreds of years, it was forbidden. A few Jews would sort of dribble back to Palestine, and then they would be slaughtered or thrown out or expelled, and then other nations simply moved in. Arabs, Christians, so-called Muslims, Turks poured into Palestine, built their buildings in 691 AD. The Arabs built a massive mosque called the Dome of the Rock. They built the Dome of the Rock on the site of the ancient Jewish holy places, that is up in Mount Moriah. See, Satan inspired that. He made sure that the Arabs built a building that they view as holy on Mount Moriah, where Abraham was to sacrifice his son in the first and the second, and in a sense the third temples were actually built. And it's still there. It's a beautiful building. It's very startlingly beautiful, the Dome of the Rock. But it is there on the site of the ancient 34-acre quadrangle where the temples of God were built. Now, you see, in 1948 the Jews came back into the land. And for centuries the Jews had prayed 4 times a week, renew our days as they once were. And God took them back because of their persistent faith and this unrelenting dogged determination to be His people, at least in a physical way. In 1947 they went back. But God didn't allow them in 1947, you see, to repossess Mount Moriah, to repossess the old part of Jerusalem. God gave them bits and pieces of a little nation, but that area was left out of the original plan. When David Ben-Gurion said we're now a people again and a nation, they didn't possess Mount Moriah. The Arabs held that territory. It was left in the hands of an Arab people called the Jordanians, and Jerusalem was in effect cut in half and partitioned into 2 areas, and the border, you see, Jordanian and the Judaic or the Israeli border ran through the middle of the city. And you know what happened in 1967, the Six-Day War took place. And during the Six-Day War, because it was time, God allowed the Jews to surge into the old section of Jerusalem, to repossess the entire city, to take control of the Temple Mountain where those buildings had been built by them, and the stage at that point was set for the fulfillment of some of the most incredible prophecies in the Word of God. Now, why are we a friend of Teddy Kollek? He's the mayor of that city where that mountain exists. You know where Mount Moriah is? It's in Jerusalem. Guess who the mayor of Jerusalem is? Very good friend of Mr. Armstrong. What is the meaning of our involvement there? The answer is contacts and favor and the expectation that someday those contacts and that favor will allow us as a church to finish our work, and we will finish our work not in the USA. We will flee when it is done here into a place of safety, and the leadership of the Church of God will then go and establish themselves in the city of Jerusalem, in the land of the Jews, in a dying Jewish nation, because God says once again, the Jews shall be made desolate. And as that desolation begins, as the city is again bombed, as the land of the Jews is again stripped and pillaged, as the temple perhaps, at least the holy place, you see, is repossessed by a Roman force, because Titus was only a type. At that point in time, God says, we as a church realize that our work here has come to an end. But, you see, that's the point. The Bible indicates there will almost be a war between Arabs and Jews over the holy places. And Europeans will intervene to stop the hostility and to stabilize the Middle East, lest the economy of Europe be destroyed by a Jewish-Arabic debacle based upon a battle over holy places. Now, someday a Jew in a prayer shawl, I don't know who or when or what sect he'll be a member of, because the Jews have sects too. Probably more of a nonconformist Jew as opposed to a conservative Jew. He'll walk up on that mountain and sacrifice an animal. I don't know if it'll be in a temple. It doesn't have to be. David didn't do it in a temple. Mr. Armstrong said a couple of months ago, he said, I'm not convinced they'll build a temple. He said, I am convinced they will bring sacrifices, maybe by the Wailing Wall, maybe up the side of the mountain. Maybe there'll be a site, and this has been, a possible supposition, maybe that temple, the Dome of the Rock, is not squarely on top of the site where the temple was built. Maybe in the archaeological digs they'll see that the Holy of Holies was a little bit towards the side of the hill. Maybe they'll try to, do it there. Maybe there will be a temple. Maybe it'll be a tent. Maybe it'll be in the open. David sacrificed in the open on that holy place. But there will be a national uproar, brethren. The Arabs are going to scream all kinds of profanities. There will be riots as a result. You know what occurred a couple of years back? It was about 5 years ago. And a group of Jews, a rabbi and a couple of other Jews, went through there's a gate by the Wailing Wall, which is right next to the mountain, you see, right next to Mount Moriah. When you see the Wailing Wall, that mountain on beyond that is the old site of Mount Moriah. But that mountain is in Arabic hands. It's the grounds for the Dome of the Rock. The Jews have the Wailing Wall, but the Arabs have the mountain. And several years back, some Israelis went up through a forbidden gate with, has a big sign that says you can't go on beyond this point, and they went up and they held a prayer meeting on the side of that mountain. Did you know some of the most incredible riots took place in the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem as a result of a few Jews praying on a mountain, because Jewish prayers are viewed as desecration of an Arabic holy place, but the Jews say that is our holy place, and the Arabs say no, it is ours. And in one sense, and this is the horror of it all, in a carnal way, they're both right. It is holy to them both. And yet both in their own way view the rights of the other as desecration of that spot. Can you begin to see what is going to happen someday? If you know what the Jews are like, if you know that when the Jews set their minds, when they feel something belongs to them, when they have had a tradition, they will follow through on it, and it is only a matter of time until there is a Jew up on that mountain, or a group of them, with a lamb, and a sacrifice takes place, and the Arabs and their neighborhoods go up in smoke. Now, as I said, I don't know that there'll be a temple or not. There are indications there may be, and there are indications there don't have to be. That's hard to say. I'm not looking for a temple. I am looking for sacrifice. That's what Mr. Armstrong said we should look for. Chapter 24 in the book of Matthew. Notice the sign to the church to flee. All of these things about the temple as the context begins, and then going on down to the gospel of the kingdom being preached, verse 14. Verse 15. And as we come on down to the end of the age, the end of verse 14. When, therefore, you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Now, holy place would seem to indicate a temple, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It could indicate a holy location. Now, David sacrificed in a holy place, but there was no temple there yet. Then, verse 16, let those that be in Judea flee into the mountains. So when you see this happen, when there is a holy place and some abomination is set up there, we flee. And if we're on the housetop, we come rushing down and we take off. Go on to them, verse 19, that are with child. To those that have nursing babies, pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then comes great tribulation. Now, chapter 21, the book of Luke, makes it a little bit clear that it's still a little hazy. And we flee when we see abominations set up, but what is this abomination? That's sort of hazy. I gotta wait to see that. I still don't know what I'm waiting to see exactly. Abomination, holy place, a little hazy. Luke chapter 21, verse 7. They asked him, what will the signs be at the end of the age? And he gave all the signs once again. Verse 18, he talked about a time of war, and not a hair in their head perishing. And in your patience possess you your souls. Now, verse 20, when you shall see Jerusalem compassed about with armies. Now, that occurred, you see, in 70 A.D. The Roman armies came across to Palestine and surrounded the city for 5 months. And the Jewish members of the Church of God who had read this knew it was time to flee, and they fled. And there was time, because that army took over the city and besieged it in stages. They came down and they surrounded it, but they let the Jews go in and out. They attempted to intimidate the Jews. But you could still leave the city. Even after the army had begun to bivouac around the outer walls of the town, you could go in and out. The Jewish members fled to Pella. So that was a type. Titus was a type. Because the Romans are going to come again. That's the point. The same nation, the same peoples, the Europeans are to come a second time, brethren. And they're to encompass the city again in the end of the age. And our people will have time to flee. Know then that the desolation thereof is nigh. That is not the desolation. That is the sign that it is very, very near when they're around the city. Because once they're around it, still time to flee. They yet have to go into the city to perform the desolation. They will not do that immediately. They will do that within a few days or a few weeks. But you'll have a little time, you see, to leave, to get ready to go. The desolation is nigh. Then let those that are in Judea, the Jewish brethren, and maybe a lot of us, maybe many of us, in fact, according to Mr. Waterhouse, maybe all of us, you see, we may stop over in Israel to give Mr. Armstrong moral support as he sets up the work of the two witnesses. We may go as a body because we'll have a 30-day period at least, you see, to fool around with. Once we have the final sign to flee and it is time to arrive in the place of safety, we may be there too, and this may refer directly to us, fleeing then into the mountains, probably off toward Petra or wherever, and fleeing out of the midst of the city, and not staying there, for these are the days of vengeance. And it talks about the city being taken captive, verse 24, and Jerusalem being trodden down of the Gentiles. Now, Mr. Armstrong will be there, and he'll be preaching to them. And he and somebody else, and I'm sure it's Mr. Armstrong, I see no other way of explaining that, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. But once again, that's a little general, you see. Here's this army, but they were around Jerusalem in 70 AD for 5 months. I mean, do we flee when the first people in the army arrive? This again is a little hazy. But if they take a month to set up, how do we know exactly when? We're given general points here. Turn to the book of Daniel chapter 12 and we'll see something very, very specific. Something very specific in the middle of the arrival of that army, you see. As the Jews and the Arabs riot, and the rioting moves back and forth, and the city of Jerusalem has become a powder keg. And so much of it will have to do, apparently, with holy places and Jews and Arabs at each other's neck. And why? When the Europeans arrive and they surround the city, and obviously they're there to, in their own eyes, stabilize the city and save the Middle East, what is the first thing they're going to do? You know the first thing they're going to do? They're going to go into the city as soon as they're set up. They're going to find that Jewish holy location. They're going to grab the guy that is sacrificing. They're going to take his knife. They're going to haul away the lambs. They're going to dismantle the whole thing and say, you can't do this any longer. And that is our sign, God says. The day that happens, we got to get out of here but quick. Now, the point is this. Why stop the sacrifice? Well, the reason, obviously, is that the sacrifice of itself and by itself is one of the main reasons why the Middle East is about to go up in smoke and flames. Why the Arabs have said to the Europeans, look, you'll get no more oil from us. If you support these Israelis, these Jews, in their effort to set up Jewish sacrificial service on the mountain, no oil. Now, that's a possible scenario, but I think it's a very likely one. The Europeans therefore intervene immediately. Chapter 12, you've read it before. Michael stands up, the end of the age. And these things are sealed, Daniel said, verse 9, till the time of the end. Many, verse 10, shall be purified and made white. That's our work, and tried, our work. But the wicked will do wickedly. Obviously they are. Verse 11, and as our work comes down to the end, from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, it is stopped. Stopped by who? By Europeans. Stopped. Why? In their own selfish effort to stabilize the Middle East, maybe get the oil, pouring out of the Arab oil wells again, and the abomination that makes desolate set up. Now that is exactly what Matthew 24 talks about. When the abomination is set up, we flee. But that was a little hazy. It says in Luke 21, the abomination is nigh when the city is surrounded with armies. But that's a little hazy. But the first part of this verse is not. This is very specific here, brethren, from the time that the daily sacrifice is stopped. When European armies march into the city of Jerusalem, and they say to the Jews, you cannot sacrifice here any longer. I mean, the whole world is going to go up in smoke if you do. And they stop it. It's 1,290 days. That's before Jesus Christ comes. We're told in Revelation 12 we spend 1,260 days in the place of safety. But 1,290 days before we have to arrive, before our scheduled arrival, this sign is given. If you tie this in with Matthew 24 and Luke 21, we therefore have a period of 30 days to play with. 30 days, you see, to sell out, to sell what we have, to make the trip, to go to Jerusalem perhaps, to be there as God's servant, is embraced by Petty Kalek or whoever he may be at the time, to see the Israelis, the Jews, calling on us to perhaps mediate somehow. Mr. Armstrong is called a man of peace. He's called a man of peace, and we will be considered people of peace. It's interesting we keep the Sabbath and the holy days. Maybe there's a tie in there. Maybe we'll be viewed to some degree as, possible mediators as a people. I don't know for sure. But our efforts now in trying to serve and reach out to the Jewish nation will result in the setting up of the work of the two witnesses, and they will begin to work in that nation, in that city, and preach to all mankind for 3.5 years. But the Jews, as their nation dies, will have the wonderful blessing and privilege of hearing daily from God's apostle or apostles, if there may be two by that time. And, a lot of things will begin to happen to them. Now, I don't have time to read, and I won't take the time to read certain things. About some of these prayer meetings and certain nonconformist Jews saying, hey, it's time to go ahead and sacrifice. I know that conservative Jews say you can't sacrifice now. I know all the reasons why people say the Jews will never sacrifice again in the city of Jerusalem. I've heard them all. God simply says they will. And once they do start doing it, boy, I'll give you a possible scenario. A group of Jewish nonconformists sacrifice a lamb on the Temple Mountain. And there's a tide of approval, even from conservative Jews, because they're looking for something to lift their spirits. There are flagging spirits in Israel right now, and that would be encouraging. The Arabs begin to scream that the Jews have desecrated the holy place, and that they may be even going on up, and maybe they want to bomb the Dome of the Rock. They'll have all kinds of ideas going on. And there'll begin to be riots raging back and forth. The USA and Britain will probably intervene and say, hey, you shouldn't do this. You should stop the sacrifice. But we're for you no matter what happens. That's the conservative position that Mr. Reagan has. He's a conservative. When it comes to the Jews, we're for the Jews. That's great. But notice what could occur someday. If the Arabs join forces and say, look, our brothers in Jerusalem, our brother Arabs, have had their holy place desecrated. And Jerusalem is the third most important holy place for all worldwide Arabs. Follow this one. They'll begin to put pressure on the U.S. and Europe and other nations, you see, to get them to put pressure on the Jews to stop this foolishness. And more Jews will be saying, let's do it. Some conservative Jewish rabbis may well have visions. Conservative rabbis have all kinds of visions, by the way. They're like Pentecostals. They have visions all the time. And they're already having visions about the Messiah coming, and that's getting quite common amongst conservative Jews in Israel. Maybe they'll have a vision saying, hey, we can sacrifice in the mountain, it's okay. We don't have to have a temple. I don't know. Maybe they will have one, maybe they won't. What God says is that the stopping of the sacrificing by the Europeans is the sign to flee. When we see that occur, when the Europeans invade and attempt to stabilize the Middle East in their own way, save their economy and their necks from Arab blackmail and pressure, then we flee. Then Mr. Armstrong is in Jerusalem. Then it seems Europe turns on the USA and on England because of things that we have said and done in the middle of all of that havoc. So I think we ought to close on that a little over time and discuss some more of it on another occasion.